Boeing hit a couple of real milestones in August. One that's probably good and one that's, well, let's say, less good. And while everyone in the aviation industry is working through a hectic summer, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, they have also been facing some quite unusual headaches. Yes, it is time for another of our monthly aviation news roundups, where we examine the main evolving stories that are affecting our industry and also smaller issues that may or may not be worth their full video on their own, but are still worth knowing about. As often before, we will start with Boeing, who have continued their recent trend with some more positive news, but still mixed with some worries. The first story is about the company's CEO, Kelly Ortberg. The 8th of August marked the 1-year anniversary since Ortberg took over as Boeing's CEO, and in case you didn't know, before that Ortberg had spent several years as CEO of Rockwell Collins and later Collins Aerospace. He then retired in 2021 after Collins merged with Raytheon to form RTX, which means that Ortberg actually came out of retirement to lead Boeing. Now, I'm not going to do a full profile of Ortberg here today, we already did that in a previous video, but the key point here is that Ortberg is an engineer, and that in his previous jobs he actually already worked closely with Boeing's engineers, since Rockwell Collins made avionics and other key systems for several Boeing aircraft. So while Ortberg isn't an original Boeing guy, he isn't new to the industry either. And early on in his tenure at Boeing, he made some very encouraging moves, like moving his family home to Seattle and seeking advice from older, positive Boeing personalities like Alan Mulally. But the truth is that Ortberg didn't really have time to ease into his Boeing job. As Scott Hamilton explained in Leham News, Ortberg joined the company while they were still in a virtual tailspin after the door plug blowout of a Boeing 737 MAX 9. And only a month or so after he had gotten to his new desk, Boeing was due to renew a contract with their biggest and most powerful workers' union, IAM 751, which represented around 30,000 workers at Boeing sites. And as we've seen in other videos, there were a lot of simmering anger between Boeing and their workers as the company's culture had slowly spiraled away from its great engineering past. So that was what Ortberg was thrown into in August of 2024. Quite a radical shift from a nice, quiet retirement, right? So how has he been doing this past year then? Well, that negotiation with the IAM 751 workers descended into a long and bitter strike, which really surprised no one. It lasted nearly for 2 full months, and at least some of the hostility between the company leadership and the workers seemed to have been down to the decisions of Ortberg. Like Boeing's so-called best and final offer, which they offered without consulting with union leadership, and that happened just 2 weeks into the 2-month strike, so obviously that didn't go down very well. But after the strike, we saw something much more encouraging. The production lines of the 737 MAX, plus those of the 767 and the 777 freighters, had remained closed during the strike, and that at an enormous cost. But production then didn't restart for over a month after the strike had ended, and of course, when winding up production, it will take a little bit of time after a strike like that, but that would be maybe around a week or so, not a month. No, instead it seems like Boeing decided to use that downtime to try and get their house in order. Ortberg decided to get the company to look inwards at their own culture before getting things up and running again. And that was despite pressure from all of their customers who really wanted their new planes delivered. So that was definitely a good thing. Now, obviously, there are still a lot of work needed for Boeing to return to their good old glory days. For example, they also have had other union contracts that they need to think about, and they still haven't certified their 737 MAX 7, that's the smallest MAX variant, or the 737 MAX 10, which is the biggest. And on top of that, there's also the 777-9 and the rest of the 777X family, all with airline customers who are growing more and more impatient by every day. And on an even more somber note, besides Ortberg's 1-year anniversary, in August this year there was another questionable milestone for Boeing. That's when the 737 family lost its last remaining record to the Airbus A320 family. According to Bloomberg, sometime in August, we don't know exactly when, the Airbus A320 family overtook the 737 as the most delivered commercial airliner in history. The Airbus A320 was already ahead of the 737 in total orders, and it has been ahead in annual deliveries too, but the fact that the 737 entered production around 2 decades ahead of the Airbus A320 family kept it ahead in the total deliveries, until August of 2025. Now, Boeing had built up a 1,500 aircraft head start during those 2 first decades, which Airbus has now just wiped out. And this suggests that Boeing now really needs a 737 replacement, which is another key task for Ortberg to do in the coming years. But like I mentioned before, there are also some good Boeing news out there, who also actually came in August. On the 25th, Korean Air and Boeing announced the airline's biggest ever single order. 103 jets, split between the 737-10, the 787, the 777-9 and the 787-8F freighter. And that's on top of an order for 40 Boeings that Korean Air had already made last March. Even more importantly, earlier in August there was news that Boeing was in talks for an even bigger order from China. And that would be a huge deal. That's because Boeing has been effectively cut out from the aircraft sales in China for nearly a decade at this point. Well, yeah, there had been some orders during that time, just 30 aircraft since 2019, but in that time Airbus has scored orders for hundreds of aircraft from China, including one single order for nearly 300 jets back in 2022. Trade disputes and broader geopolitical tensions have kept China's airlines from ordering Boeing airplanes. And even deliveries of already ordered aircraft have looked doubtful until recently, with the 737 MAX crisis definitely not helping. But this could now be changing. According to Bloomberg, the deal that Boeing is discussing with China could be for as many as 500 aircraft. And of course, that could still fall through, but if it doesn't, it could be an indication that Boeing's luck in China is now finally changing. And if that's the case, would that just be a coincidence? Well, probably not. Firstly, there are more news indicating that Airbus also has been in talks for an aircraft deal in China for another 500 aircraft. So, in effect, the two manufacturers could still end up sharing the next big order from the country, involving multiple different airlines. And secondly, as Liam News has pointed out for some time now, China needs Boeing about as much as Boeing needs China. You see, China is a huge aviation market, and even if they wanted to punish Boeing for geopolitical reasons, the reality is that they just can't do this forever. Airbus and local manufacturer Comac simply can't make aircraft fast enough to satisfy China's need, and with Comac still relying heavily on foreign suppliers to build their own planes, this interdependence likely won't change for the foreseeable future. So, the talks about Boeing selling 500 planes to China tells part of the story here, but like with so many aviation stories, the full narrative really depends on where you look. So to get a clearer picture while researching this, we turn to our sponsor, Ground News. Let me show you how it works. When we search for Boeing jet sales, this specific story with over 50 articles came up, and at a quick glance we can see that 23% are from media conglomerates and just 8% comes from government-owned sources. Ground News makes it really easy to see how the coverage shifts depending on political lean. For example, the left-leaning Sherwood News highlights the commercial angle, focusing on Boeing's rebound after Airbus was close to a similar deal, while the right-leaning Straits Times frames it as a strategic move, suggesting Boeing is edging closer to a major agreement with China. Same event, very different angles. Ground News also lets you check each outlet's factuality and ownership, making it easier to know what to trust. And if you check out my custom Mentour feed, it pulls together all of the aviation and aerospace news that I normally talk about. It's awesome. So if you want the full picture, not just the loudest headlines, check out ground.news/mentor below or scan this QR code. That will give you a whopping 40% off the plan that I use. That's just $5 per month for a limited time. Big thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Now let's continue. A fifth 777-9 joined 4 other test aircraft for a push to get that type finally certified, hopefully before the end of this year. The company is also working closely with the FAA to come up with scenario-based planning as a strategy to allow the 737 MAX production rate to increase above 38 aircraft per month. Now, in plain language, what that actually means is that Boeing is looking at various what-if scenarios to see how they would deal with problems in production if they were to be allowed to produce 737s faster. And to do that, they are working closely together with the FAA, who is checking their numbers and adding its own requirements. For now, that 38 737s per month production limit is still there, and up until a few months ago, Boeing couldn't really build planes faster than that anyway. But that has since changed. Boeing actually reached that rate in the summer, months ahead of schedule, and they've been promising faster aircraft deliveries to their customers as a result. Our next story is highlighted by a seemingly minor but potentially important in-flight incident involving Air China Flight 856. This is a 13-year-old Boeing 777-300ER who was flying from London Heathrow in the UK over towards Beijing in China on the 26th of August. The flight had 251 passengers and 15 crew members on board, and according to the Aviation Herald, the flight faced an engine failure en route, which meant that they had to drift down from flight level 350 down to flight level 240. They then obviously had to also divert to deal with the broken engine, and since Air China flies over Russia, they ended up landing at Nizhnevartovsk airport in Siberia. Fortunately, another Air China 777-300ER was soon able to fly over there and pick up the stranded passengers, many of whom presumably were British nationals who might have been, well, a little bit nervous about being stranded in Russia unexpectedly. In total, these passengers and crew spent only about 13 hours in Russia before departing and arriving in Beijing safely, so it all ended very well. Apart from that damaged Boeing 777, which still remains stuck in Siberia. And that is a little bit of a problem here, because sanctions continue to impact Russia since the country's escalation of the war in Ukraine back in 2022. And because of that, many airlines avoid the country's airspace entirely, which means that they have to fly further and burn more fuel, but some airlines, including those from China and a few others, continue to still overfly the country. And there have actually been even more interesting questions about Russia and its aviation industry lately. You see, Boeing stopped buying titanium from Russia back in 2022, which meant giving up a joint venture with Russia's largest titanium producer, VSMPO Avisma. But Russia didn't stop titanium exports to the US or to other sanctioning countries. And the latest news is that VSMPO Avisma is now hoping for titanium exports to restart and for its joint venture with Boeing to be reinstated. So, is that likely? Well, that obviously depends on how the war in Ukraine evolves. But honestly, if Boeing and Airbus have found alternative suppliers with fewer geopolitical risks involved, it's kind of hard to see them returning to Russia. But I guess, never say never. Now for our next story, we're going to look at something that got a lot of attention in the news this August and which I have actually made a Mentour pilot video about a long time ago. And the reason it got attention was because some passengers felt so strongly about it that they decided to sue Delta and United Airlines. And that's the issue of window seats, or specifically those that doesn't actually have a window next to them. Now, in case you haven't seen this before, yes, there are some aircraft, including the Boeing 737, who I fly, that are missing a window in one or more rows. So, why is that then? Well, in the case of the 737, if you look at approximately where the leading edge of the wing meets the fuselage, you will see that there's a missing window on either side. And that's because the air that we all breathe in flight comes from the engines, before the combustion stage, so it's nice and clean. This air is then processed and cooled, and after that it has to make it to the roof of the aircraft to reach those swiveling vents that you have above your seat, as well as to the side risers. And that air goes through pipes in the wall, right where those missing windows are. I should note here that the 737 isn't the only aircraft with such an arrangement. The Boeing 757 has it too, and many Airbus A321s have similar window arrangements. Now, obviously, none of this is any news for anyone. Boeing 737s, 757s and Airbus A321s have been made this way for decades now. But the reason that United and Delta are getting sued is because they allegedly didn't mark these seats in their websites to explain that they're windowless, like other airlines do. So this meant that several customers apparently paid extra to select those seats to get a nice view, and they were then understandably quite upset when they found themselves sitting next to a wall. Crucially, the class action lawsuits are for over 1 million passengers per airline, which could end up being quite expensive if they are successful. And that could then set some precedent for other airlines who doesn't warn their passengers about these specific seats. A little bit silly, but also a little bit funny. Our next story involves something that the aviation industry, or actually all industries, really don't like, especially during a busy summer season, and that's strikes. The one that probably got the most attention this month was that of Air Canada's cabin crew. That strike involved about 10,400 flight attendants who all walked out on the 16th of August, forcing the airline to grind to a complete stop. Air Canada flies around 130,000 passengers per day, who therefore all had to be rebooked or compensated, which obviously created chaos in the busy summer season. 3 days in, Canada's Industrial Relations Board declared the strike unlawful and called for the cabin crew to return to work, but their union decided to defy that decision. The main issue at stake here was the way that cabin crews were paid, which did not include the time spent boarding and disembarking, which is the case in many airlines actually. The union argued that when factoring in the actual time spent working, the flight attendants made about 30% less per hour than Canada's federal minimum wage. Even with the airline's improved offer, made a couple of days into the strike, the union said that the cabin crew's pay was effectively still below minimum wage. But in the end, a further improved offer convinced the cabin crew union to return everyone to work, which happened on the 20th of August. In the final offer, the airline agreed to compensate cabin crews for 1 hour before the flight for narrow bodies or 70 minutes for wide bodies at 50% of their hourly rate, which would then become 70% of their hourly rate after 4 years. But this sadly wasn't the end of the disruption. You see, it takes time to get things going again after such a stoppage, and Air Canada estimated that it would take 10 days after the end of the strike to get back up to normal capacity. So in the end, the strike likely affected over 1 million passengers. Now, there is quite a bit more to discuss here beyond the scope of this video that include things like the calculation of block times and the way that this affects crew schedules, flight and cabin crew pay, and also passenger compensations in case of delays. So let me know in the comments here below if you'd like me to make a separate video about that. And while you're down there, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel as well. Anyway, summer strikes aren't just impacting Air Canada or the airlines. Airbus workers in the UK also announced in mid-August that come September they will go on a strike for 10 days unless the European manufacturer makes them a better pay offer. This union, Unite, represents about 3,000 mechanics and engineers, and their job at Airbus is to make the aircraft wings. In fact, all Airbus wings are made in the UK, aside from some who are assembled in China. Now, Airbus says that they have already made a competitive offer to their workers, but obviously the union disagrees, arguing that inflation and rising living costs are impacting their members, while Airbus enjoys good profits. So, if there is no deal here, the first strike will have already taken place by the time that you watch this and will then continue intermittently. So that's Airbus, but Boeing isn't without its own strike worries either. As Ben explained in the July news roundup, this year was the turn of Boeing's IAM 837 workers' union to negotiate. And these are the workers who build fighter jets like the FA-18 and the F-15 in St. Louis, Missouri, where they actually build some wing components for the new 777X as well. In July, we said that a strike was possible. And sure enough, that's also what happened on the 4th of August. And as we're recording this video, in the last few days of August, the strike was still ongoing, with no end in sight. Now, Boeing have improved on their initial offer, but the union, which represents 3,200 workers, has rejected it. And negotiations apparently broke down completely on the 27th of August, with no timetable for talks to resume. Hopefully, this will have changed by the time that you watch this, but in any case, Boeing's CEO claims that this strike is much less disruptive than the one that the company faced a year ago. Our final story involves the somewhat fluid nature of the low-cost and ultra-low-cost airline market in the United States. We have discussed this in previous videos, explaining that airlines like Spirit and Southwest have in recent years revisited their low-cost operations models a little bit. And Spirit has also faced some serious financial problems, while Southwest is currently busy reinventing itself after giving up its free seating policies, introducing premium seating options, and now charging for checked-in bags for the very first time. But is it fair to say that low-cost carriers are on the way out, or are there some exceptions to this trend? Well, during the last month, Spirit's problems seems to confirm the negative trend that we have seen previously. The airline emerged from a restructuring process a few months ago, but it continues to see weak demand on its key routes, and its cash reserves are now getting lower and lower. The airline's shares since the restructuring have lost 42% of their value, so the latest news is that Spirit is now engaging with new advisors to explore its options. But interestingly, Spirit's misfortune does not seem to be affecting Frontier, another ultra-low-cost carrier based in Denver, who is active in many of the same markets as Spirit is. Frontier has tried to acquire Spirit several times, first in 2022 before JetBlue made its own ill-fated offer, then again earlier this year, but Spirit's board has refused. The interesting news from Frontier is that they see Spirit's and Southwest troubles as a growing opportunity. Despite Spirit's lack of demand on key routes, Frontier believes that it can succeed where Spirit failed. But how? Well, some of Spirit's cash flow issues comes down to grounded aircraft due to Pratt & Whitney engine issues. As we recorded this, Spirit has 38 of its 91 Airbus A320neos out of service, while Frontier only has 6 parked Airbus A320neos out of its 82 jets. And that obviously makes a huge difference in cost. Then there's Southwest, which is trying new things like adding its first international destination since 2021, St. Martin in the Caribbean. But interestingly, Frontier believes that the fact that Southwest is now also charging for checked-in bags will work in Frontier's favor. You see, the free checked bags were a key differentiating factor for many passengers, so Frontier believes that Southwest's change has now actually leveled the playing field. Obviously, there is much more to it than that. Frontier also has introduced premium options, moving away from a pure ultra-low-cost carrier model. But what all of this shows is that even if we keep seeing changes in the low-cost carriers, none of this means that they are going away. But what do you think? Do you agree? And are there any other aviation stories from August that we should be keeping track of? Let us know in the comments below. Also, if you find these videos interesting, I hope that you're also following Ben and my podcast, Captain Speaking, which is available here on YouTube, on Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. On there, we look at everything from aviation news discussed from our own pilot perspectives, or just swapping life stories and wisdoms, because why not? But we also answer your questions, so make sure that you send them in on whatever platform that you find. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.